This is lesson 4 of Introduction to Salmon Habitat Restoration. If you recall, in lesson 1, we focused on a single species of salmon, the Chinook salmon. In lesson 2, we looked at 3 species of salmon, pink salmon, sockeye salmon, and chum salmon. Now, for chum salmon and sockeye, they were forms of those species that do use habitats similar to pink salmon, primarily large river channels or large side channels for spawning. In lesson 3, we looked at 3 other groups of fish, 3 other species, again, chum salmon, sockeye salmon, and now coho salmon. But in this group, these fish focus on groundwater fed habitats. So here we are in lesson 4. We're going to talk about another form of coho salmon and steelhead trout and cutthroat trout. Now, steelhead and cutthroat are also in the genus Oncorhynchus, just like the other 5 species of salmon. So we're going to include them in this basket of fish. And we're going to call it, this group, the backyard team. And the reason is these fish live in many of the small streams that in fact are in the backyards of people in British Columbia. They also are somewhat unique from the other species in they spend a lot longer in fresh water. So a coho salmon, before they go to the ocean, may spend 1 year and sometimes 2 years. Steelhead trout, 1, 2, or 3 years. The same for sea-run cutthroat trout. And both steelhead and cutthroat have resident forms. For the steelhead, that's called a rainbow, and the cutthroat is called a resident rainbow that may spend their whole life in stream habitat and never go to the ocean. In this section, we're going to be talking about a lot of the restoration, stream restoration techniques in the toolbox. And the reality is many of those techniques were developed specifically for the backyard team, or at least they can be applied to the backyard team. Anyway, we'll be talking more about it in lesson 4. So lesson 4 is broken into 3 modules. We define why the certain species and forms, coho, steelhead, and cutthroat, are put into a grouping called the backyard team. In Module 2, there's a detailed discussion on the value and development of off-channel habitats. In Module 3, there's a summary of the opportunities and challenges facing all our Pacific salmon here in Skautsjamuk. And finally, on slides 45 to 47, are the various references that include the links to all the papers, research papers, or articles, or even short videos referenced throughout this presentation. For the YouTube version of this presentation, all these references will be shown in the YouTube video description. So you'll be able to watch the presentation, refer to the slide number of an article you perhaps want to read later, go back to the description, get the link, and hopefully that'll make the presentation more understandable and interesting. I hope you enjoy lesson 4. So the backyard team is led by the most common type of coho salmon that generally spawns from September to December in many streams, small and large. And these coexist in virtually any stream, many in our own backyard, that they can access here in Skautsjamuk. Also, I include 2 of the other Oncorhynchus species as team members, as we've discussed. They're not quite salmon. They're the steelhead or rainbow and cutthroat. Now, all these species live in the stream for a number of months or years. Coho typically migrate in their after 1 year of rearing. But the more interior you go and the farther north you go, these are cooler streams, they often will live 2 years in the stream before migrating to the ocean for a final 18 months of ocean residency. Cutthroat trout, steelhead, somewhat similar. Steelhead will live approximately 2 years, sometimes 3 years in freshwater before migrating, similar to sea-run cutthroat trout, but some cutthroat trout and actually some steelhead in the form of rainbow live their entire life within streams. So for this reason, they are critically reliant on the quality and quantity of the stream and riparian habitats, and that's what this story is about. So these three species have placed bigger life cycle bets on the streams than the other salmon species have, and therefore what happens in those streams matter more to the backyard team than their more ocean-focused cousins. So the other thing that sets this team apart, these three species, they've built quite a following of salmon advocates over the years, as all of them were highly desired sports fish, coveted by the angler community. So young anglers often grew up to be passionate salmon advocates and were in many instances the founders of streamkeeper groups working to protect their home salmon streams later in life. Now, even if you were not an angler, many BC children grew up around the small streams of their neighborhood, and the smallest fry of their local waters were in fact the coho salmon, cutthroat, and steelhead trout that they learned to love and protect as they grew up. The people salmon, as some would say. So on the other side of the coin, the term loving them to death has a sort of relevance to these species of salmon because they tend to live in the smaller lowland streams in the valleys. Us humans covet for all sorts of things. They really have taken the brunt of some of our worst impacts. We love them, but we have treated them very badly across their range wherever we live together in close proximity. I think for this reason, we collectively have spent more effort on these species in the past decades to come up with ways to restore what we have damaged and try to keep these salmon, which we love, in our lives. So looking at our table of contents for our salmon habitat restoration toolbox, virtually all the techniques listed here were either developed primarily for our backyard team or can be at least productively applied to them. So let's work our way down this list, see how they might be applied to our BT buddies, and see where we end up. So for the previous three lessons, we talked a lot about larger engineered salmon habitat restoration projects, which are both appropriate for the species involved and for the larger streams many of these species dominate. But for the backyard team, the smaller habitat restoration projects can be just as effective, in some cases critical, for these species' survival. So let's begin our talk about a simple salmon habitat restoration project that involves another much loved species of salmon, a dear friend of the backyard team, the now famous yellow salmon that sometimes lives on a street near you. A simple truth of salmon habitat is that good salmon habitat relies on sources of clean water. And many of our more urban streams have suffered over the years from preventable pollution events. So one salmon advocate decided they were tired of hearing about salmon kills in their local streams from oblivious residents pouring some noxious material into the storm drain, not knowing these drains led down to the local creek. Joe Cambeets, DFO Salmon Enhancement Program Community Advisor and Coquitlam First Nation member, came up with an idea back in 1975 that could help prevent these unintended pollution events. And so the Yellowfish Storm Drain Marking Program was born. Joe's both an artist and visionary. His idea caught on and has flowed out of Stashkamuk, north, south, east, and west, saving many salmon lives along the way, and has now gone around the world. A good idea that with the right equipment and training could be delivered by interested citizens, and that has restored clean water to many a stream. Simple. If you want to learn more about his idea and now DFO program, click the link below. Another simple idea: plant a tree, save a salmon, which is not too far from the truth in our small streams around BC. The smaller streams in particular, where our backyard team often resides, are very vulnerable to low flow periods. Now, with too much sun hitting the little pools that are left for the salmon fry to survive in, if they get too hot, this can be catastrophic. So plant a tree, save a salmon does make sense, and with a little planning and organization and some professional guidance, anyone that wishes to be a salmon habitat restoration participant with a shovel and a little sweat, again simple. And besides, who does not love a tree? This picture is a nice introduction to Chapter 5, Restoring Fish Axes. And this would be best described as a fish unfriendly culvert. It would take a really motivated salmon to jump into this culvert and swim like heck through the fast flowing shallow water in the culvert to make it to spawning grounds located upstreams. For most fish, this would be the end of the line. Now, as fish folks would call this a bad culvert, no offense intended. So remember the article we talked about in lesson 1, the 1,000 barriers. Well, a lot look just like this. Okay, let's dive a bit more into chapter 5. So let's talk a little bit about chapter 5, restoring fish access, just as an example. So during the development of many of our smaller salmon streams, various culverts, weirs, or other barriers were placed in the way of upstream migrating salmon, often with little thought of the consequences. They just needed to get to the other side. So this is an old weir which was placed in the Brunette River sometime very early in the 20th century and was a challenge for many salmon trying to swim upstream for at least 50 years or more. So not too much of a problem for some, since salmon were almost gone in this watershed by the 1960s. But in the late 1970s, local salmon advocates, again a fish and game club, individuals working with the brand new SEP community advisor hand-built this little concrete fishway to help salmon over the old weir. Now, this was the very first salmon habitat project done on this river, and it began a remarkable story of 40 years of salmon recovery in this watershed. If you recall, it was one of the stories I gave you a link to, Welcome Home. This situation is not unique in our local rivers and streams, and there lies the real opportunity to work to fix these barriers throughout our area and start recovering some of which we lost so long ago. The habitat exists, it is simply not accessible to salmon, and that's technology, and that's just hard work and negotiation. These barriers can be fixed. Simple. So if you go around the lower mainland streams, you'll see all of these techniques applied to get fish past existing culverts that were placed in streams and weren't very considerate of salmon migration. So if you look on the lower left, that's a boulder fishway placed to get fish over the Caribou Dam at the outlet of Burnaby Lake. That's a beautiful fishway that's passable by adult salmon of all the species of salmon in the river, and juvenile salmon can actually use that one. It's a very good design. Upper left is a steep pass, Alaskan steep pass, designed to overcome some of the challenges from the Great Alaska Earthquake from 1964, but it doesn't look like a very friendly place for fish. Looks like a washing machine, but in fact, adult salmon can go up that quite easily and get over large dams like the one we see in the picture. The upper right, typical culvert, box culverts were often shallow when it was low water, too shallow or too fast in higher waters for salmon to migrate through them. So a series of baffles are placed on the bottom, and this is similar to the baffles we placed in Hastings Creek to get them into Upper Hastings Creek in North Vancouver. Down below, you'll see a round culvert with a nice red coho salmon, and often culverts can have gravel placed on the bottom. It roughens it up, makes it easier for both adults to get up, but also for juveniles to get up these smooth culverts. And then on the far lower right, this is an old culvert out by Spanish Banks. And you can see very shallow, very difficult for adults. The gentleman standing there getting up. And we simply built a large boulder riffle downstream and made a little dam, and the water backed up in the culvert. The fish spawn up the gravel riffle, which they're used to doing, and then swim right through the culvert. These are all techniques that can be used on hundreds, possibly thousands of culverts around the lower mainland here in Skashtamuk for the benefit of salmon. This is from Chapter 6, Rehabilitating Stream Banks. So eroding stream banks are part of the natural process of river migration and creates healthy salmon habitat. So note the slide of the eroding right-hand bank of the upper Chilliwack River, which is an untouched watershed as we've previously discussed. And remember, the large trees that grew along the banks are slowly rolling into the river, but not going very far. So you have a very complex bank formed as the river slowly migrates. Okay, so this is typically not what we see in our more impacted watersheds, as we've discussed. The riverbanks have been denuded of their natural forest cover. They are soft and vulnerable and release large amounts of sediments into the streams with each flood event. Now, in some cases, it is decided to try, and it's not easy, it is challenging, but to try and revegetate those banks to reduce the speed of erosion in special cases where that erosion and the materials entering the stream are unacceptable. Now, usually this involves benching the banks, planting some vegetation, in this case, on the lower picture, these are willow whips planted in the spring that will put down roots and grow. But it involves also placing some rocks or logs along the banks to harden them up down at the toe where the river comes against these slides. But we'll talk about placing woody debris in Chapter 8 a little bit more. Effectively, we're trying to get that slide to grow plants would put their roots down, and we're trying to stabilize where the river is coming against the bank and causing the slump to occur. So in this case, as an example, in the Coquitlam River, this is marine type clay that was being continuously eroding, and then a large slump would come down into the Coquitlam River, which often had the color, as they say, of a sidewalk, gray. So it was hard for the backyard team to find a bug when you could not see in front of your nose. During the winter, the Coquitlam River would be gray more days than it was clear. So benching, willow whip planting, some boulders and large woody debris along the toe at the river's edge did the trick. Simple actions, in this case, and very good outcomes on the Coquitlam River. So Chapter 7, Rehabilitating Off-Channel Habitat. So maybe I will leave this discussion to the end. It is rather complicated. So let's just jump ahead. Let's talk about a range of chapters from 8 to 12. And they're all basically about putting large stuff in streams to make them scour bigger pools and provide more hiding places in the stream for our backyard team in high water and during low water. So all of our land use decisions over the past 100 years have generally made our streams much simpler with less large log jams. Remember, the size of the timber has decreased as the forests have been harvested. Shallower pools because the large wood doesn't resist the flow and foresee energy to dig that pool. A lot of shallow open water, which little salmon don't particularly like for rearing in for the next few years of their life, particularly as they get larger. They like more complex habitat as their body size increases. And all the members of the backyard team are going to spend from 1 to 3 years in these streams, and they will be getting bigger through their life. So the challenge of putting stuff in our streams here in Skashtamuk is that dreaded rain on snow event. Now, most of us like to stay indoors on the worst rain day of the winter. But it is worth your while to go to your local stream and watch all the action during a flood. Remember that word, humble. So here's a warning. If you're going to put things in stream, they have to be designed to be there when the water goes down. If they are gone, what's the point? So in Chapter 9 of our toolbox, there is a broad discussion on various types of logjam designs. So why do we construct these artificial log jams? Well, because log jams form critical summer and winter rearing habitat for our backyard team, and they are good for our little guys. Now here's an example of a large natural log jam in the upper Chilliwack River, that undisturbed watershed. Now note the size of these logs. They're large, and the complex roots they have that are perfect refuge habitats for small fish to hide in when things get ugly during a winter flood. So the size of these logs means this log jam will likely not move except in an exceptional high water event. But these large trees do not exist anymore in the vast majority of streams in Skashtamuk. So using what we see in the upper Chilliwack River, if we are going to create artificial log jams, then my bias is toward constructing log jams that are complex enough to break the energy of the flow during the higher water events, like this example, and that is not easy. So simpler log jams in smaller streams particularly can provide the scouring energy around them during flood to make good summer rearing pools for all the species of the backyard team. However, only complex log jams can give critical winter cover to the smaller members of the team during the winter flood season. So here are two examples of log jams constructed in the Chilliwack River, and they both provide good cover for rearing salmon during the summer months. Now, neither of these simple jams would be a wise choice for a young salmon to hunker down for the winter flood season. So being in a washing machine seems a good analogy for trying to exist in these log jams during a large winter flood. And from the little guy's perspective, all that summer fat that they had on their back in September would be burnt by January, and they would likely not make it to spring. So more complex log jams are required if critical winter habitat is the desired goal. So let's talk some more about how we might do this. So here is a complex log jam that has formed on the outside of a bend in the upper Chilliwack River. Now, if you look at it closely, it likely started to form when a few large trees jammed going around this corner during a flood. Now, later high waters brought more small trees and branches that then jammed against these large key logs and are now providing a complex log jam. So this large jam replenishes itself at each high water as more small debris is captured, and that small debris forms the critical habitat that coho salmon juveniles particularly need to survive this season. So to design such a debris catching log jam, there needs to be two things in the design. First, they should be located on the outside bend of the stream, as the wood debris follows this flow path during floods. Second, the log jam has to be designed to be stable in this highly energetic part of the stream and be shaped to capture that floating wood debris, thereby creating this complex log jam habitat. So read about Streamside Large Woody Debris Catchers, Chapter 9-17, Control, click below. And then let's look, after you've read that section, an example of these debris catcher designs used on the Coquitlam River. And again, a little warning. Remember, log jams are only effective if they don't float away if the big wet one comes your way. So with that little warning out of the way, here are a series of log jams. You'll see 6 in this picture, placed on an outside bend of the Coquitlam River in the late 1990s that are still functioning today. They were designed and placed at this location to capture additional small wood debris coming down the river in order to make a more complex habitat for small salmon of our backyard team. So if you put on your snorkel on a fine summer day, you will find schools of young coho salmon living in and behind these constructed log jams. The coarser wood holds the jam together. The finer wood makes a more complex hiding place and habitat for those young fish and breaks up the worst of the current in and around and behind the log jam. But just off the tip of the log jam, the water is actually accelerated. So in these faster and deeper areas near the log jam for hiding cover if a predator shows up, but in the deeper water you can watch the steelhead parr, the larger steelhead parr, dancing in the current, picking off bugs as they rocket by. So the species are segregating in the log jam depending on the species and the size they are during the feeding period in the summer. So these log jams were designed and installed by experts. They're tied together with steel cable and anchored to boulders under and around the log jams. They look simple, but they're not. That said, they have functioned well now for over 25 years and probably will for another 25 years. So this experiment was a success. So again, the simple message: think once and again and again. Act once and assess, adjust, simple. These log jams worked. They were placed in the right place, they were well designed, and they provide valuable habitat for our backyard team in this very urban and impacted stream, the Coquitlam River. As they say, go big or go home. I think the North Shore Stream Keepers project out on Mosquito Creek got the message. I think this log jam's probably going to be around a while, and I would imagine our backyard team are going to really enjoy it for many years to come. So boulders placed in streams, forming these points and in groups of boulders, well, not as effective for use by rearing coho salmon because they don't have the same protection from fast water and the complex hiding spaces formed by all the small wood debris found within the log jam are still helpful to coho fry and are really liked by the 2 trout salmon on the team. These boulder points in our impacted, simplified streams roughen up the stream bottom and edge, which is good news for all the little ones of the backyard team. Now, the other good news is they don't break loose and float away during a big flood to plug up the culvert or the bridge downstream and take out the road and get you into the evening news. Okay, maybe I worried too much, but the things I have seen. So here are some rock spurs on Lynn Creek, an urban stream in the North Shore of Vancouver, which might be more appropriate for some of our smaller urban streams, which often have lots of culverts and bridges along their lengths, than log jams for the reasons I previously mentioned. So notice the small pools and rough edges and patches of spawning gravel formed around and behind these rock spurs. Not too bad. Basically, stable, large stuff in streams makes them more complex, which is good for our little fellas. The hard part is getting that stuff to stay when the big, wet one comes our way. You need professional help on your team for these ones. They look simple, but they're not simple. So to sum up what we're looking in these two pictures on Lynn Creek, if you look at the upper picture, the river main channel is hard on that bank, and this point of large rock has created quite a complex pool. Lots of depth, lots of hiding spaces for the bigger fish, particularly the trout, to jam into in case there's a predator comes by. And even for the smaller coho fry, they find that quiet water they look for in the first half of their summer. But later in the year, in the winter, there's too much energy around these rocks to be a good type of habitat for coho fry to spend the winter in. Because their habit is to jam themselves deep in a log jam in that small woody debris, or even get out of the stream and find a little side creek or a habitat that we'll talk about later called off-channel habitat. Now the trout species are a little different. They avoid the big winter floods by jamming themselves under stable boulders, and that's what we're looking at. So they like this habitat particularly well. In the lower slide, you'll see the main channel of the river at low water is more into the center of the channel. Now at high water, it comes over this rock point, and if you look at it, it's collected gravel both upstream and downstream, but as the water cascaded over the point, it scoured a little back channel. And this is perfect habitat for small coho fry when they first come out of the gravel. They look for this dead quiet water until they grow big enough to move out to somewhat deeper water in the main stream. So again, even this rock point that the river is not directly against during the lower water has created useful habitat. The idea of habitat diversity in simplified streams is really important to keeping healthy salmon populations in those streams. So these rock points and boulder groupings is a good technique. It's very safe in the urban area and doesn't really create a lot of issues with materials moving downstream. So, okay, we're going to skip over chapters 13 and 14 because they're way too complicated for us to discuss here. So, read the chapters 13 and 14 if you can, and know peeing in the stream does not qualify as low-level nutrient replacement. Check out chapter 13, or augmenting minimum stream flows. Check out chapter 14. Control click, read the chapters. So what are we going to talk about is chapter 7 and chapter 15. Off-channel habitats, chapter 7, which we skipped over previously, and the last one in our list, managing beavers, which sort of go hand in hand because off-channel habitat is beaver habitat, along with coho habitat, cutthroat and steel habitat. Looking at that picture, you get the point. So we've mentioned the West Coast rain on snow flood a number of times previously. So one of the most extensive efforts to help the backyard team here in Skouchetamuk has been the focus on creating safe refuges from these winter floods, which is important to these species that must live in our stream for months and sometimes years before heading down to the sea. So one area of particular importance has been the creation of what is called off-channel habitat. Again, chapter 7. Here's a link. Have a good read. It's an interesting story. So what is this off-channel habitat? And how is it formed? Well, it is as simple as knowing this fact of life. Rivers move. So over time, a river erodes its banks, and slowly or quickly, sometimes in big floods, it changes channels and leaves all sorts of old channels and depressions, some filled with groundwater, across its floodplain. Now these side channels or sloughs or ponds, if the beavers move in, are called off-channel habitat. And our team, particularly coho salmon, absolutely love these areas. The creation of off-channel habitat has been far and away the most important and effective technique to improve the productivity of coho salmon streams here in Skaushtamuk. And we're going to talk about why. So as I said, these side channels or sloughs or beaver ponds, particularly coho salmon, love these areas. So this statement above brings 2 points we need to discuss a bit more before we dive into our off-channel discussion. While coho absolutely love this habitat and need this habitat, it's called critical habitat, particularly in the winter. The other team members, not so much. We've talked briefly about this when we were talking about those rock points created on Lynn Creek previously. The other point is beavers, which are absolutely obsessed by this type of habitat, which can cause some problems for our own backyard team. So I would say for the other two team members, cutthroat and steelhead, this is not their main type of key habitat. That lies typically in the flowing waters of the stream. But many a fat and happy cutthroat can be seen swimming about in an off-channel beaver pond. Their cousins, steelhead, if they stay in the river for their entire life, called rainbow, can be very happy in off-channel areas, but like cutthroat, prefer the rockier, boulder-studded streams with some log jams thrown in. Steelhead tend to prefer the bigger rivers and leave the littler stuff for the cutthroat trout to enjoy. So an idea of segregation of habitat, but there's overlap of habitat also. Coho specialize in off-channel, whereas cutthroat and steelhead occur in off-channel. Steelhead and cutthroat specialize in mainstem habitats, particularly boulder-bedded streams, with the cutthroat preferring the smaller tributaries, the steelhead the larger, and coho also occur in the main stem for at least the summer period, but not so much the winter. Again, overlap and some segregation. And it's partly how these species deal with winter floods, which on the wet coast here is a big deal if you plan to survive till spring. So the trout species, as we talked about in Lynn Creek, typically during a flood jam their noses under a large boulder or even a root wad. Now they need something stable to do that. It can't be just a gravel bed that's moving in a flood. It has to be something large and stable, like a boulder or a permanent log jam. The coho salmon typically, well, they'll use complex log jams, and they will survive in these habitats over the winter if they're complex enough and they don't have too much energy during a flood. They're low energy. They're jamming into the small stuff, particularly that's buried in the big logs. Most of the coho want to actually get out of the stream when the river turns ugly. So that's the last point where I really tell what off-channel is. And also, we'll talk a little bit about those beavers. So this is a beautiful natural piece of off-channel habitat that exists on the floodplain of that undisturbed river, the upper Chilliwack River. And you'll notice it looks to me like it was a significant part of the river at one point, a major channel. Something happened to make the river move. It could have been as simple as some of those large trees that we saw earlier in the presentation moved, created a log jam, the river got jammed up, and it just took off on its floodplain and cut itself a new channel, and this one was left behind. Now you'll notice it's not dry, so it must be getting some water, either from a groundwater aquifer, perhaps in the river floodplain to the left, or perhaps some water moving down that big talus slope, either in a formal stream or just water moving through the talus on that steep hill to the right. But the water is clear and stable. This is classic off-channel habitat for coho juveniles that seek out this type of habitat, particularly in the winter, to get away from those large rain-on snow events in the main stem. But there may be a little issue in this off channel that we're going to talk about, shown by the red arrows. So if you look closely at where those little arrows are, those are actual beaver dams. Now, look to the right and left, you see lots of young vegetation, some of it willow, which is their primary food for beavers. So from a beaver's perspective, stable flow, doesn't have to fight the floods. This is perfect habitat for beavers. And what do beavers do? They build dams to make the water deeper to keep them away from their major predators. So the beaver dams are creating more ponded habitat, which is good for our guys, the backyard team, particularly coho fry. They like the beaver ponds, but also those dams, if they get too big, our little coho fry, which are coming in from the river, trying to get into these areas, they run into these beaver dams. So they either have to try to wiggle their way through them or wait for a rainy day and swim over them. But the larger they get, and the more stable the water supply, like groundwater, the more difficult it is for those little coho fry to get past each of these dams. So this is just a little closer look at a typical beaver dam in some of these off-channel habitats. You can see the water's flowing through it, not necessarily over it, suggesting that there's little passages. Now, if there's a good rain and enough flow comes the off channel, it may go over the beaver dam. So if you're a big coho salmon heading up to some upstream spawning grounds, or even if you're a little coho salmon, they're pretty good at actually getting over these dams or through these dams, given the right opportunity. So where the problem comes is if this is a purely groundwater fed channel, we don't get those rain events affecting the flow. So without flow spikes, it's harder for the adult salmon to get over them, and just as hard for the little ones to get over them. So this is a picture of a much larger dam, and as we know, beavers don't seem to really take any time off. So they tend to build the dam as high as they can, as high as the banks allow that dam to be built. So the pond just gets bigger and deeper until the beaver runs out of banks and can't build a dam any higher. So again, if you're in a stable water supply, at some point these beaver dams get so large, no upstream migrating coho, whether a juvenile or an adult, are going to be going past this beaver dam. So in off-channel habitat, the amount of off-channel habitat in a watershed really is a critical factor in the health of the coho population. So if an amount of habitat is existing but not accessible, that's an opportunity for salmon habitat restoration. So there's a whole chapter in the toolbox devoted to how can we have beavers and salmon happily coexist in off-channel. Chapter 15, Managing Beaver Habitat for Salmonids. It's worth reading twice and then again, because off-channel is critical habitat for our backyard team. Okay, because of the importance of this type of habitat to our backyard team, let's talk a little bit more. What is this off-channel habitat anyway? So looking at this picture, you have steep mountains on either side and a flat floodplain. It's a typical BC site. The blue line is the stream meandering across its own floodplain. Often there's gravel deep under the stream where over the millennia that stream has meandered and deposited gravel. So there's an aquifer down there often. Then you get side channels. Let's say a log jam forms as we discussed and a side channel opens up multiple channels in the river. That's a side channel. It's actually flowing from the river. We talked about that in the upper pit, constructed side channels. But we also have old channels that have been fully abandoned by the river that are fed by groundwater, somewhat like the description of the channel we just talked about on the upper Chilliwack. So a groundwater fed channel. Then of course, we talked also about beavers. They occupy these areas and they create a beaver pond. These are sort of the three major categories of off-channel habitat here in Skashtamuk. Okay, let's go from that conceptual picture of a typical off-channel habitat in a floodplain, and this is a real picture of a real place. This is a bird's eye view of the lower end of that upper Chilliwack River, that undisturbed watershed that we began this talk in. If you look at the little yellow arrows, you can see all these little hints of old past channels that now form groundwater fed channels, marshes, and ponds scattered across the floodplain. These are natural off-channel features. And if you look off to the right, that very tiny little feature shown by the red arrow is another off-channel habitat. You can see it would have been an old channel of the river, but a long time ago it's now largely separated from the river. So what does it look like from a ground ice view? So here's another view of that, what was a small little feature. It's actually quite large. This is that off-channel groundwater fed side channel of the upper Chilliwack River. And you can see it looks like it has a muck bottom. It's got emergent vegetation. I can see a big sedge meadow on the far side, and alders are growing on the old river bars before the mature forest gets a hold of the big conifers later in this channel. So if you're a little coho fry and you move in here, let's say in the early fall, and you spend the winter away from that very dynamic main river channel, you have a very high chance of survival. In fact, the literature suggests survival of coho fry in habitats like this is up to 70%. So groundbreaking research was done in Carnation Creek. It's a small watershed on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And part of that research started to look at the impact of logging, the effect on how logging affected things like log jams in the mainstream, but also they looked at how this off-channel habitat was used by those stream salmonids, primarily in that case cutthroat and coho salmon. These are absolutely key studies. They're really interesting. And I think if you read them, you'll get a sense why off-channel is so important to our backyard team. And we'll be talking a little bit later that where off-channel does not exist, primarily because the streams have been changed so much and the landscape has been developed, why it's important to create and restore these off-channel habitats if we want our backyard teams to remain healthy into the future. Anyway, have a click on the two studies below. Really interesting reading if you want to learn more about off-channel habitat. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about the biology of these off-channel habitats, how they're used by various species of interest. So these are a picture of juvenile coho salmon. In the center of the picture, there's a big fat juvenile coho that was captured through minnow trapping in an off-channel habitat on the Coquitlam River. On the right, these are, you can see just a hint of two, looks like maybe three coho salmon preparing a nest in a constructed habitat, off-channel habitat along the Chilliwack River. What benefits does off-channel habitat provide salmon? Well, we've talked quite a bit about it. this off-channel provides those stable and safe places for juvenile cutthroat and rainbow to rear and adults of these species to spawn, particularly during the winter flood months. And this is important for Scouse-Tamuk backyard team species. So we're going to use some visual images for the lower Chilliwack River. That's the Chilliwack River that flows out of Chilliwack Lake. It has been a highly disturbed watershed, but looks to the naked eye at least relatively undisturbed. But I think we saw in the earlier slides it's been heavily logged for over 100 years. So this is the main stem of the Chilliwack River, not too far below the lake, maybe 10 kilometers below the lake. Do you notice the large boulders and relatively swift water? This would be classic steelhead habitat. Not so much coho juveniles, where they would tend to be more tucked along the bank in the quieter water during the summertime. But there's gravel, lots of gravel. I'm assuming lots of insect life in the stream bed, in the clean gravels are falling from this riparian zone into the stream. So it's a really good place to be a juvenile salmon on a bright summer day of all three species. But then the fall rains arrive, sometime in September. And then a little while longer, you'll see the first snow on the mountains starting to pile up. And by early November, we can have quite a bit of snow actually on the mountains, and we get something called a pineapple express. It's a warm Pacific flow of air up from Hawaii. And this is the initiation of the dreaded rain on snow flood event. So this is a little farther downstream on the same river, the Chilliwack River. The water's a little turbid. We've had an early fall rain, and in this reach, just upstream, is some rather unstable clay slide banks, which give it that slightly gray colored texture as the fall rains begin. So pretend you're a fat little coho, you've had a good summer in the river, and if you look at that bridge, there's some coarse rock and some quieter areas behind. You've been tucked in there, swimming along, having a good time, growing, feeding, doing well. And you're enjoying this fine November day. The sun, you can see, is shining, and the leaves are starting to fall. And the odd bug is still falling from those trees, so life is good. But then the rain starts, and then it kept going. And then it started to pound down, and for 3 days, it kept going relentlessly. So that beautiful snow high on the mountaintops all started to melt. And all the mountain creeks started to make noise and roared. So on the 4th day, you wish you were somewhere else. So this is a picture I took of the same exact spot. This is the Chilliwack River on one of the last rain on snow events. I had the pleasure to be out in the field getting wet and watching all heck break loose in the river. So imagine you're now that little coho fry. You were hanging out behind that rocky point, behind that bridge footing, which was meters above the bridge deck. And all of a sudden, this happened on the 4th day. And you really wish you were somewhere else. So does this bridge, because during this floods, there was a question whether the bridge would survive. So what did you do? As the flows increased, you sort of washed downstream and you glued yourself to the riverbank, trying to find slower water. But as the water got higher and higher, it actually came over its bank and started flowing into the forest. So off you went, looking for that quiet, off-channel habitat. So as you laid there in a puddle, many days after the rains had stopped, in fact, your puddle was just that. It was a puddle in the floodplain forest, which was getting shallower and shallower. And as it got just about dried up, your last thought was, I should have listened to my mother and moved into that off-channel pond last September when she told me to. Oh well, that is life in Skoushtamuk stream. So what's the message? Listen to your mother. So this is a little off-channel habitat just downstream from that bridge that is going through a major flood event. The day after the rain stopped, so the sun is starting to shine again. This would have been an old abandoned channel of the Chilliwack River. It's near where people live now, and we like to give things names. We called it Lovely Pond, although I suspect the coho salmon would in fact agree with that name. And meanwhile, on that day when you're thinking this may be my last day in my shrinking puddle, your brother, Bob, and he was always Mom's favorite, had swum up from the Chilliwack River into this nearby off-channel habitat, Lovely Pond, in the first fall rains of September. So the 4 days of hard rain in this habitat had just given the pond a nice fresh feel. And all those nice cattails growing in the marsh, the rain washed a lot of bugs. So Bob had a lovely morning snack before he did his morning exercise. It was quite quiet in the pond, so he had to keep in shape, just swimming gently in circles. What a life in off-channel heaven. Message: listen to your mother. Okay, let's sum up some of the biology. We have been talking about how these species use off-channel habitat. For coho, they both use off-channel for spawning habitat and rearing year-round. So if they're spawning upstream of an off-channel habitat, those fry may rear in the habitat for year-round. However, the critical time that this habitat is highest value is during the winter. So it's called critical habitat during that period of time. And from those scientific studies I referred to previously, if you are a juvenile and in fact move from the river in the fall into off-channel, you have about a 70% chance of surviving to smolt next spring. However, if you were one of those juveniles that remained in the river and chose a log jam that maybe wasn't that stable, or a boulder point that became very highly energetic during the flood, they found around 15% chance of surviving to spring. Now these are big differences. So think about that. The same number of spawners in a stream return to 2 streams. Same number of fry come out. They rear all summer. In September, there's 100 juveniles in one stream and 100 juveniles in the other. In a stream with functioning off-channel habitat that these juvenile coho can get into, 70 smolts go to the ocean. In the other one, 15 smolts go to the ocean. This is a big difference. So this is why the creation of off-channel habitat has been and will be one of our most effective restoration tools for the backyard team, particularly coho salmon, that we have used over the years in many streams in Skoushtamuk. So I'm going to use 2 examples, the Coquitlam River and Chilliwack River, where there's been quite extensive studies on the effectiveness of this restoration tool. Again, remember, think, discuss, plan, take action, and then assess. So the picture off to the right is a typical constructed off-channel habitat on the Coquitlam River, and there's a series of these projects created all along the river corridor. So this is a summary of what was found from research studies on what happened. So the Coquitlam River, it was estimated there's about 250,000, 250,000 square meters of habitat that young juvenile coho can access and use and rear over the length of the river. This is the total habitat available to them. So during beginning in 93 and over the following 15 years, a series of off-channel habitats were created that added up to approximately an additional 30,000 square meters of this critical off-channel habitat was created. Now this represents slightly more than 10% of the total habitat available to coho juveniles. So the habitat base in the watershed increased by 10%, a relatively modest amount. But when assessment studies looked at the total number of coho smolts coming out of the watershed, they found that 10% of watershed habitat, critical winter habitat, was producing 50% of the coho smolts coming out of the watershed. Effectively, a relatively small change in the habitat base had doubled the number of wild coho salmon produced by the Coquitlam River. This is a big deal. So how does that relate to other studies? Very similar results have found on other studies done in the Lower Mainland. One comes to mind in the Cheakamus, but perhaps the most thorough one was done on the Chilliwack River. I won't describe it here, but I've given you the link. It's well worth reading, and it will tell you the story about off-channel habitat restoration here in Skashtamuk and what it means to the backyard team. So it's time to wrap up our story about the backyard team. As we talked about, the backyard team truly lives in many of the same places as we do, and often in someone's backyard. So they have taken the brunt of our impacts to their habitats over the last century. On the other hand, because these salmon live so intimately with us, many of us grew up seeing them in our home streams or angled a worm trying to catch them when we were young and exploring our world. All I can say is most of the techniques described in the Fish Habitat Rehabilitation Procedures Toolbox can be applied to this group of salmon. Not too much more to say except for salmon habitat practitioners just starting out. The backyard team are the ones you want to get to know first and see if you can be part of their future by the efforts you make on their behalf. Once again, if you enjoy reading a long and winding story on this key team member of this backyard gang, the coho salmon, it can be found here on this link. Control-click. So a few last thoughts on salmon, how salmon habitat restoration might play a role in their future, and perhaps some discussion about some of the things we're reading in the headlines these days. I've talked about the blob, but it's not going to be unique, unfortunately. The North Pacific has always had good decades and poor decades for salmon survival, but the blob was something special. And looking forward, there is a suggestion that the coming decades will be even more unstable and challenging place to be a young salmon. So in the ocean areas, in some years, they'll be cooler and more productive, and some areas will be warmer and less productive. And how each salmon population is doing is a result how they migrate through the ocean. As we've discussed, every population has a slightly different strategy how they move and migrate through the ocean over their multiple years at sea. And only time will tell which populations do the best in these unchanging or in these rapidly changing times. But that's the nature of biodiversity, and that's why salmon are still here after a number of glacial periods they've survived, because the diversity in the populations of salmon and within the populations of salmon is the key to their survival. Our role is to try to give them the best chance in freshwater to maintain that diversity so they can face the challenges they're going to be facing in the ocean over this century. So, like this headline says, why are Bristol Bay sockeye runs breaking records while other areas struggle? And if you look to the right, Yukon River hits the lowest chum runs ever. And just south of the Yukon in Norton Sound, pinks surge. This will be the story of this century. So unfortunately, it appears uncertainty will be the new normal, and we can only do what we can do. So even for all this uncertainty in the ocean, for species such as Pacific salmon who have survived multiple ice ages here on the Pacific coast, I still bet on them. These are wonderfully adaptive species that will change their habitats and behavior as the world changes around them, if given half a chance. And this is where we come in. Salmon habitat restoration helps give them half a chance to access clean water, abundant spawning grounds, and deep river pools to hold and rear in. Helping them is the least we can do, since they have helped and supported us and our families since the glacier melted back into the hills and the people showed up, marveling at the abundant food supply our salmon. Let's not forget, we are all salmon people. So this is what giving them half a chance looks like in our world today. So out of the blue 2 years ago, the Big Bar landslide could have meant the end of a 5,000-year salmon presence in the upper Fraser River. But our salmon people got up and said, not on our watch. The salmon habitat restoration team should all be very proud of their hard work to make this large, natural Fraser River rock slide at Big Bar passable to salmon these past 2 years. This has been the largest salmon habitat restoration in recent BC history, and this salmon story is still being written. So remember, Chapter 5 and 6, Restoring Fish Access, these folks have probably read that and are applying it. Something positive, something we have done, something we should be proud of, and something to think about that will shape our future actions. So we've talked a lot about the whys, the where, and the whats of the salmon habitat restoration projects, but we haven't talked about the details of the how. How do you do it specifically? And I think you'll get a theme from the various stories we told is generally you bring into the partnership when you're developing a concept idea, a technical individual or group that has those skills that is needed to deliver just the nuts and bolts of the actual technique. Now, how did those individuals get those skills? Often they went to school, they got some training, education, and they worked on teams that with other people that have done previous works and learned. So really that's the path. One way to accelerate the path might be to get on with your education and get a few letters behind your name, and also to take some technical courses if that's what interests you. So I've given you 3 contacts of individuals that might be able to provide some advice what education path might help you move along if you're interested in salmon habitat restoration as a career. And I just want to say it's always good to make friends in this business, know the capacity of your friends. And yeah, when you find an interesting project, you have a project idea, you just start to talk. And at some point, develop your team and see where you end up. Good luck. So this wraps up our lesson 4. And a couple, I think, thoughts about what we discussed in this lesson. So the stream rearing fishes, what we call the backyard team, the steelhead, cutthroat, and coho salmon, really have the most opportunities for assisting them in their habitats because their habitats are heavily dependent on the quality of the stream, not just for spawning, but for the rearing phase, which can be multiple years in length. So there's many tools can be applied for these species. Steelhead and cutthroat tend to be more dependent on the main channel habitats or side channel habitats. Steelhead tend to specialize in the slightly larger streams, and cutthroats tend to specialize in the smaller streams. That's how they segregate themselves in watersheds. So often, let's say the mid-sized streams of the North Shore, Mosquito Creek, you'll find rainbow or steelhead. In the lower reach from tidewater up in toward the headwaters. But as you get into the smaller tributaries, perhaps only 2 or 3 meters wide, you will find it'll shift over to cutthroat trout. So those two species have very similar habitat needs, but they've segregated themselves. Various studies have shown that actually steelhead or rainbow tend to dominate cutthroat when they are in mixed populations. They're a more aggressive fish, and for whatever reason, they get the habitat they want first. Now, where do coho fit in? During the summer phase, they tend to dominate the pools of the stream, the slower water, and the margins of the stream, where the trout species tend to dominate the faster flowing areas, the upper ends of the pools or the riffles. That's how they segregate in the watershed. And coho tend to dominate the lower end, and at some point the upper tributaries are pretty well the domain of the cutthroat trout. Now, what happens though when the fall rains come, the three species segregate once again. The steelhead and cutthroat tend to stay in the flowing areas of the stream, but they hide under rocks and boulders in the stream itself. They stay out of the floodwaters by hunkering down into the stream bed or in a real complex log jam, whereas coho juveniles need that slow water that they lived in most of the summer, those pools, but those pools are too energetic. That's why they're pools. They scour out during floods. They're not a good place for young coho in the fall. So they either have to jam themselves into the small woody debris trapped in these log jams, basically zero velocity habitat during a flood because they got their head jammed in between 5 sticks and a wad of alder leaves, and hope that that wad of alder leaves with a bunch of fine material doesn't wash away in the flood, or alternately they are strongly adapted to move out of the stream looking for the marshes and the wetlands and the side ponds, particularly beaver ponds in the flood plains. So those are all the ideas of ecology of these species, and that's where our toolbox comes in. We can apply various tools for these species and try to target it on the populations that we're interested in. All of the tools benefit all three species, but they benefit more certain species. So the in-stream works tend to focus more on the trout species with benefits to coho, whereas the off-channel habitats tend to focus on particularly winter habitat for coho juveniles, but steelhead and cutthroat will move into off-channel and do quite well, but they're not as adapted to seek out off-channel as coho salmon. So again, knowing the ecology of these species, knowing your particular watershed, there may not be any opportunities for off-channel in these narrow urban corridors. Whereas in these glacial streams with broad floodplains, there may be a wealth of opportunities for off-channel development. It depends on your watershed. So once you know the ecology, your watershed, really you look at your toolbox and say, what can I practically implement to do the best I can for the backyard team in my stream? And really this is what this lesson has been about. Now, taking it beyond the fourth lesson, let's talk about the entire presentation, lesson 1 to 4. Really, I think we've discussed it many times, this idea of personal, getting to know your watershed and how the species that you're interested use your particular watershed before looking at what techniques are applied. Often, I have seen people assume that I can apply this technique because it worked in one watershed and it's just a simple thing to apply it in the next watershed. Just looks like the same. Why wouldn't it work? Well, there's often reasons why it did not work in one watershed while it did work in another. Again, this is where the makeup of your team comes in. You want to have a mixture of people that know the ground very well. That's the local knowledge. You want those people that have done multiple projects and seen successes and failures of the exact same team to technique applied in different watersheds. And then, of course, you need those real technical people that know how to dig the holes and wire things together and move heavy equipment. That both is from an engineering perspective, but also the machine operators. You will find there are machine operators that are absolutely masters at creating beautiful fish habitat with these large, noisy, heavy equipment. Whereas another operator will make you something that's quite bleak and sort of works, but is just a missed opportunity. So again, it's that idea throughout this discussion is the knowledge of your teams is really important for successful projects. No single individual can do it all. So again, hopefully all of you will be able to find a niche where you can contribute, whether it's picking up garbage so we don't pollute our urban streams, or marking storm drains so no one dumps material down a storm drain to take out all the fish in the beautiful physical habitat downstream, or to manipulate the habitat in an actual restoration project as part of a team. Or even those people that go to the political level to open doors so work can be done on the landscape, or people that apply to funding sources to find the funds necessary to make this type of work happen. All of you are important. All of you need to collaborate and work well together to deliver a successful project. So my hope is this introduction to salmon habitat restoration will give everyone an idea, some of the things that have worked, to start generating those discussions on what might work in your particular watershed and start generating some thoughts on who you would need on your team to make it happen. So I wish everyone really good luck. We have an interesting century ahead of us with climate change. I remain optimistic. Our salmon are wonderfully adaptive. We just have to help them in their freshwater environments so they can face the changes we know will be happening in terms of climate impacts, both in the freshwater and in the big blue sea. Good luck. So thank you for listening to these stories on salmon habitat restoration in Skaushtamuk. And let's share one last story in the link below about the unique and beautiful Upper Chilliwack River watershed where our journey began. A river from a time before we changed the world and therefore where salmon habitat restoration has no place. Truly a watershed to think about and remember the salmon world as it was. And with that, so ends our journey. And we will invite you to ramble along the Upper Chilliwack River. Remember, walk like a bear, with this video made by my big brother Joe. So this is a list of 19 references that were presented during lesson 4. In reference 1, a link to the DFO storm drain marking program. Reference 2, a link to restoring fish access in the Fish Habitat Rehabilitation Procedure Manual. Reference 3, Ministry of Transportation and Highway guidance on fish passage through culverts. Reference 4, winter habitat preferences for our species of interest from a U.S. document. Reference 5, Chapter 9-17 in the Fish Habitat Rehabilitation Procedures Manual, Streamside large woody debris catchers. Reference 6 for some interesting reading on BC in-stream enhancement techniques. And reference 7, read the chapters 13 and 14 in Fish Habitat Rehabilitation Procedures. Reference 8, read chapter 7-1, Off-Channel Habitat in the Fish Habitat Rehabilitation Procedures Manual. Reference 9, read chapter 15, Managing Beaver Habitat for Salmonids in the Fish Habitat Rehabilitation Procedures Manual. Reference 10, a Carnation Creek study on fish forestry interactions. Reference 11, Carnation Creek study on fish forestry interactions. Reference 12, the fall movement of coho salmon juveniles into off-channel habitats. Reference 13, a study done on the Chilliwack River to look at the benefits of off-channel creation for coho salmon. And reference 14, a Washington State, USA stream restoration toolbox document. Reference 15, a story about coho salmon here in Stauschkamut. Reference 16, changes in the ocean environment and how this may affect salmon survivals due to differences in migration patterns between populations. Reference 17, the various salmon stories found in these lessons can be found on the Fraser Valley Watersheds Coalition website. Reference 18, one last story about the unique and beautiful Upper Chilliwack River watershed. And reference 19, a video about a visit to the Upper Chilliwack River to see the spawning sockeye salmon. I hope you've enjoyed lesson 4, and I hope you have enjoyed this series on Introduction to Salmon Habitat Restoration here in Stauschkamut, the lower mainland of southern British Columbia.